The ocean roars as towering waves crash against weathered wooden hulls, sailors clutching trembling hands to rigging, eyes fixed on distant horizons. Salt sprays their faces, stinging like tiny knives, while the cold wind slices through their bones, whispering tales of danger and discovery. These explorers, braving storms and uncharted waters, pushed human endurance to its limits, often with perilous creatures lurking unseen, snakes, rats, and even dangerous animals that found their way aboard. Life aboard these ships was a constant battle between man and the merciless sea, driven by dreams of new worlds and riches. Behind every voyage was a story of courage, suffering, and the relentless human spirit. If you're passionate about maritime history and want to learn more about these daring journeys, be sure to subscribe and reach 3,000 followers. Drop where you're watching from and tell us, are you ready to set sail into the past? You ever wonder what it was like to be crammed into a wooden ship, salt in the air so sharp it stings your eyes, wood damp from the sea spray, and the cold biting into your bones? Imagine the relentless sound of creaking timbers, the squeal of the rigging, and the distant cry of seabirds overhead. That's the brutal world of the age of exploration, when sailors braved the unknown, driven by dreams of wealth, empire, and adventure. Today, we're diving into that gritty reality, especially focusing on the wild, sometimes dangerous animals that traveled alongside those brave explorers during the colonial era, centuries before our modern safety standards. Let's take a step back to the ships themselves. Colonial vessels, galleons, caravels, and later ships like the man of war were marvels of their time. Built from oak and seasoned pine, their hulls relied on thick planks joined with wooden dowels and iron nails. These ships had to endure months, sometimes years at sea. Their design was a constant balancing act, light enough to sail swiftly, but sturdy enough to survive storms and shipwrecks. The decks were often narrow, crowded, and filled with the chaos of rigging, sails, and the constant movement of the ocean. Imagine being a sailor on these ships, hours turning into days with little relief. Conditions were extreme. The air was thick with salt, mold, and the stench of unwashed bodies. The crew's routine was brutal. Early mornings, always on alert, repairing torn sails, navigating through storms, or just trying to withstand the boredom and despair. Hierarchies were strict. The captain, usually a seasoned mariner, commanded with authority. The master and officers handled navigation and discipline. The common sailors faced grueling labor, often with little hope for rest. And life at sea was perilous. Storms could turn ships into floating splinters in a matter of minutes. Ice-cold water and biting winds could freeze the skin, especially in colder latitudes. Disease was a constant threat. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C, dysentery from contaminated water, and fever from infections. Food: mostly salted meat, dried beans, hardtack, and sometimes rats or insects that found their way aboard. These weren't just inconveniences, they were deadly. Now, you might think the biggest threats came from the sea itself, but during those long voyages, sailors also had to contend with some truly dangerous animals. And yes, some of these animals traveled right on the ships, stowing away in cargo holds or lurking in the cramped spaces below decks. Let's talk about 8 animals that could turn a voyage into a nightmare, dangerous, unpredictable, and sometimes deadly. First up, rats. Not just a nuisance, but carriers of deadly diseases like the plague. They thrived in the damp, dark corners of ships, and their populations could explode in weeks. Sailors dreaded seeing their shadows scurry across the timbers, knowing that once rats appeared, sickness spread rapidly. Then there are mosquitoes. During long tropical trips, they became relentless. Their bites cause fevers, sometimes deadly, like malaria or yellow fever. Imagine lying in your hammock, scratching at itchy bites, while the ship pitches through stormy seas. These tiny pests could wipe out crews in days. Next, the ship's own cargo could hide venomous creatures. Snakes, for example, sometimes stowed away in boxes of spices or textiles. One bite from a venomous viper or rattlesnake could mean death within hours, especially with limited medical help aboard. Sea spiders and jellyfish also pose threats. Jellyfish, with their stinging tentacles, could cause painful, even life-threatening reactions. In warmer waters, sailors often had to deal with swarms of stinging creatures, their tentacles brushing against exposed skin. Then there were the more exotic dangers, like monkeys or parrots, that sometimes arrived as cargo or companions. While seemingly harmless, some monkeys carried rabies, and their bites could be fatal. But perhaps the most unsettling were the insects that hitchhiked in cargo or on sailors' clothing, like lice. These tiny creatures caused intense itching, but more worryingly, they could transmit typhus, a disease that decimated crews and could wipe out half the ship's population if unchecked. And let's not forget about the animals that were intentionally brought aboard, like the ship's cats. While they kept down rats, cats themselves could sometimes become aggressive, especially when hungry or frightened in the cramped, noisy environment. Their claws and bites, if infected, could also lead to serious infections. All of this paints a vivid picture of what life was like for sailors on those treacherous journeys. The ships were floating worlds, filled with danger, both human and animal. The sailors' resilience wasn't just tested by storms and starvation, but by the constant threat of dangerous animals lurking in every corner. This was a time when survival depended on knowledge, courage, and sometimes sheer luck. The animals on board weren't just pests, they were threats. Their presence added an unpredictable element, reminding everyone that the ocean's vast, mysterious realm was full of surprises, some deadly. So as you think about these brave explorers, remember the small, dangerous creatures that traveled with them. They were part of the harsh, unforgiving environment of the age of exploration, a world where human grit was tested in ways we can only imagine. Can you imagine what it was like to be crammed aboard a wooden ship, hundreds of miles from land, with the salty air sticking to your skin? The deck is creaking beneath your feet, the wind howling through the rigging, and the smell of rotting wood mixes with the sharp tang of sea spray. It's cold one day, scorching hot the next. The constant motion makes you feel like you're on a roller coaster that never stops. And that's just the beginning. Today, we're going to uncover the human side of those long, dangerous ocean voyages during the age of exploration. How sailors endured hellish conditions, deadly animals, and their own broken bodies. If you love history that pulls you into the gritty reality, stay with me. And if you like this kind of storytelling, do hit that like button. It helps more people discover these incredible stories. Also, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now picture yourself aboard a ship from the 15th to 18th centuries. These vessels, whether the nimble caravel, the massive galleon, or the sturdy frigate, were floating prisons, death traps, and life-saving machines all rolled into one. Seafarers didn't choose this life for comfort. They chose it for adventure, wealth, or survival. But what they faced out there, it was brutal. The voyage itself was an ordeal of epic proportions. Imagine the ship's hull groaning under the weight of 100 men, cargo, and the unpredictable fury of the Atlantic or Pacific. With no modern navigation tools, they relied on the stars, the sun, and plenty of luck. If storms hit, oh, and they did, they could tear the ship apart. The sea was a monster, unpredictable and cruel. And then there were the animals. Yes, animals. You might think only of humans suffering, but the ships were alive in a different way, teeming with creatures that could turn a voyage into a nightmare. Think about rats, thousands of them, gnawing through ropes, bedding, even the ship's wooden planks. These rats were carriers of deadly diseases like the plague. It's estimated that rats could make up about 20% of the crew's suffering, and that's not counting the lice, fleas, and other little critters that thrived in the cramped, unclean conditions. But the real horror, it wasn't just the rats. It was the animals, like the Portuguese man-o'-war, a jellyfish with tentacles that can stretch for hundreds of feet, stinging anyone who brushed past. Or the chiguatera fish, which could be caught and eaten by sailors desperate for food, bringing paralysis or death. Sometimes, seabirds or fish with toxic flesh would hitch a ride, spreading toxins or disease. Now let's talk about the humans. Imagine the sailors, boys of 14, hardened men of 50, facing this chaos day after day. The constant exposure to cold, salt, and wind wore them down. Gengiva sangrando, dentes caindo, gums bleeding, teeth falling out. Malnourished, dehydrated with sores that festered under layers of salt and dirt. They would vomit overboard, clutching their stomachs, their bodies trembling from seasickness or fever. Many succumbed just to the relentless strain, their bodies giving in to what we'd call now extreme exhaustion and disease. And it wasn't just the weather or animals that killed. The crew faced diseases that spread like wildfire. Dysentery, scurvy, malaria, typhoid. Scurvy alone. Approximately 20% of sailors died from it. No fresh fruit or vegetables meant their gums bled, teeth rotted, their strength draining away. Hemorrhages, pain, confusion. It was a slow, agonizing death, often in the tiny, damp below-deck cabins. But it gets worse. Imagine a day when a sailor's leg gets infected from a cut. Back then, a wound could mean amputation, often performed with a dull knife, or just letting it fester until the man died. And if a sailor became delirious or collapsed, well, he was sometimes just tossed overboard to reduce the burden. Cruel, but real. What about the psychological toll? It's hard to grasp how these men kept going. Imagine your family, your home, your life all so far away. The loneliness, the fear. Some sailors went mad from the endless motion, the howling wind, or the sight of friends dying. They'd watch their comrades turn pale, cough up blood, or fall into unconsciousness. The ship's crew, often just a handful of men, became a tiny universe of suffering. They relied on routines, rations, watch shifts, prayers to keep some sense of order in chaos. And how did they survive? Necessity made them resourceful. They'd use everything, seaweed as medicine, tar to seal leaks, even animal fats to soothe chafed skin. They'd boil rats to make broth, or eat stale bread and dried fish, which fermented and grew mold. Sometimes they'd resort to cannibalism, especially if they'd been adrift for weeks with no hope of rescue. But don't forget, they also had tools: compasses, astrolabes, simple medicine kits with herbs, bandages, and some alcohol. Yes, alcohol. It was the sailors' analgesic, their anesthetic, their way of dulling the pain. Rum, gin, brandy. It's what kept many going through the night watch, numbing the constant ache of body and mind. As the ship sailed on, the human toll mounted. Imagine the physical transformation. Pale, gaunt faces, sunken eyes, cracked lips, tattered clothes, dirt-streaked skin, the smell of sweat, salt, and decay, all blending into one horrifying aroma. Some sailors developed scurvy gums, their teeth bleeding, their gums swollen and raw. Others couldn't stand straight, trembling from malnutrition or fevers. Their bodies became a shadow of what they once were. And still they pressed on. The voyage was a test of endurance, physical and mental. Each day brought new dangers. Storms that threatened to swallow them whole, animals that could bite or sting, diseases that could wipe out entire crews. It was a prison afloat, a mobile death trap, yet it was the only way forward to new worlds. If you want to know exactly how sailors coped with these horrors, what they ate, how they patched their wounds, how they kept their sanity, there's a whole video on that on the channel. Just click here. But for now, let's step back and appreciate the resilience of those brave souls. They faced the unknown with courage, driven by hope, greed, or necessity. And many paid the ultimate price for that push into the unknown. So next time you board a modern cruise or fly across the ocean, think about what those sailors endured. Their suffering wasn't just physical. It was soul-wrenching, transformative, cruel, but real. And that's why their stories matter, because they remind us how far we've come and how much we owe to those who dared to sail into the abyss. And if you like this deep dive into maritime history, stick around. There's more coming, more stories of survival, adventure, and human grit. Thanks for riding along with me on this journey through the brutal, fascinating world of colonial sea voyages. Now imagine yourself on a wooden ship, miles away from land, sailing into the unknown. The air thick with salt and mold, creaking timbers under your feet. The horizon stretches endlessly, but what you can't see are the tiny, deadly passengers hiding among the cargo and in the dark corners of the ship's hold. These weren't just rats or insects. No, some animals aboard these ships were downright dangerous, and their presence added layers of horror to the voyage. Let's dive into the world of colonial maritime travel and meet some of the most perilous creatures that shared the voyage with sailors. Because, trust me, the dangers weren't only from storms or disease. Sometimes the real monsters, the silent killers, were animals you'd never expect. First up, the infamous Lernaean serpent of the seas, the venomous Portuguese man-o'-war. Imagine a floating nightmare, translucent, pulsating, with tentacles stretching for dozens of meters. It drifts through the Atlantic currents, invisible until it stings. Sailors learned quickly that these creatures could cause excruciating pain, paralysis, even death. Back then, they had no antidotes, only crude remedies like vinegar baths or scraping stings with shells. Many sailors, especially in warmer waters, had their days cut short by these deadly jellies, their bodies marked with welts and scars that lasted for weeks. But not everything was so visible. Some dangers lurked in the dark, like the brown recluse spider that sometimes hitched rides in cargo crates. These tiny, shy spiders could cause necrotic wounds, flesh that rotted, infections that spread fast. Imagine you open a crate and a spider scurries out, hidden in the shadows. Weeks later, a crew member's leg swells, turns purple, then black. Medical knowledge was primitive. Amputations were common, but many succumbed to infections. The spiders, like many animals on ships, were a cruel surprise waiting in the shadows, eager for a more shocking story. Then consider the Brazilian wandering spider. Its neurotoxic venom could cause paralysis and intense pain, sometimes within minutes. Sailors sometimes caught these spiders in their bedding or clothing. They'd get bitten, their muscles seizing up, tongues swelling, breathing labored. Without antivenom, some sailors faced death or lifelong disabilities. The crew, desperate, would try to crush or trap these spiders using whatever tools they had, tongs, broken glass, even their bare hands in a panic. The risk was real and the consequences severe. But not all animals were just dangerous. Some were downright invasive and carried their own threats. Take the rats. Oh, the rats. These furry, scrappy rodents thrived on ships. They gnawed through ropes, wood, and provisions. A rat infestation could wipe out a cargo of dried fish, grains, or fabrics. Worse, rats were the primary carriers of deadly bubonic plague bacteria. Their fleas would jump ship, infecting crew members before anyone knew what was happening. Entire crews sometimes succumbed to the plague, a silent, invisible killer that thrived in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of the ship's lower decks. And still, there was the lesser Antillean viper, a small but deadly serpent that sometimes hitched rides in crates or ballast. Its venom was a potent neurotoxin, capable of causing bleeding, paralysis, and even death. Sailors, unfamiliar with these creatures, would often stumble upon them in dark corners or while walking through cargo holds. The snake's tiny fangs packed a punch, and with no anti-venom on board, the outcome was often grim. But how did sailors cope with these dangers? How did they survive aboard these floating arsenals of death? The answers lie in the ingenuity and resourcefulness that marked their daily lives. When animals were spotted, crews would set traps, use fire to chase them away, or crush the pests with makeshift tools. They learned to recognize the signs of venomous bites applying vinegar or laying hot cloths on stings. If someone was bitten, they'd try to keep them calm, immobilize the limb, and hope for rescue at port, if they made it that far. Imagine, though, the constant tension. Every cargo crate could hide a spider. Every shadow could be a rat's hideout. The ship's crew was always alert, always wary. A rat bite might seem minor, but it could mean infection, death by plague. A spider bite, a slow, agonizing process. Some sailors developed a remarkable tolerance, built their own immunity through experience. Others, not so lucky, paid the ultimate price. The ship's doctor, if there was one, relied on herbal remedies, crude poultices, or just hope. Sometimes they'd burn herbs or scent the ship with aromatic oils to repel pests. But against some animals, these measures were just a delay, not a cure. Think about the sailors who faced these threats daily. Their bodies transformed under the strain. They'd wake up with swollen limbs, bloody gums after biting insects, or scars from close encounters. Their hands trembled as they tried to patch wounds with torn cloth or tar. Their skin was rough, sunburned, and sometimes scratched raw from constant scratching or fighting off pests. Gingivas bleeding, teeth falling out from malnutrition, or infections eating away flesh. These were the silent, invisible enemies aboard. The ship's construction itself was a part of the danger. Ships built from oak and pine, with nails hammered in by hand, created habitats for all these creatures. Holes in the planking, gaps around cargo, damp holds, perfect breeding grounds. To combat this, sailors would seal cracks with tar, reinforce cargo holds with planks, and keep the ship as clean as possible. An impossible task in the cramped, humid environment. They knew that if rats or spiders gained the upper hand, it could mean death for the entire crew. And it wasn't just about survival, it was about knowledge, adaptation. They observed animal behavior, learned which animals were most dangerous, and devised strategies accordingly. For instance, some crews would sprinkle tobacco or herbs around the hold to repel pests. Others kept cats aboard, a common practice because cats kept the rat population in check. These animals weren't just pests, they were part of the ship's ecosystem, and sailors depended on them for survival. In comparison to today's modern ships, equipped with pest control systems, anti-venom, and sanitary routines, the colonial sailors had none of that. Their tools were simple: fire, traps, herbs, and their own instincts. The risk of encountering a venomous serpent, a biting spider, or a plague-carrying rat was a constant shadow over every voyage. And yet they pressed on, driven by necessity, greed, or curiosity. So next time you see a rat scurry across a modern cargo hold, or a spider spin a web in your home, remember what these sailors faced centuries ago. Their enemies weren't just the elements or the ocean. They were tiny, deadly animals lurking where you least expect. They had no modern conveniences, no anti-venoms, no pest control teams. Just their ingenuity, their courage, and a stubborn will to survive. Stay tuned, because the world of colonial seas was full of surprises, not only in human resilience, but also in the animal kingdom's ferocity. The ocean was a vast, deadly arena, and the animals aboard made it even more treacherous. If you want to know how sailors fought back, what tricks they used, and how they stayed alive in this living, breathing nightmare, there's more to come. For now, just breathe in that salty air and imagine what it took to face these tiny monsters on the high seas. Imagine yourself aboard a ship hundreds of years ago, a wooden beast carved out of oak and pine, stretching out over the endless, unpredictable ocean. The salty air hits your face, rough and sharp, like tiny knives slicing through your skin. The wind howls past the sails, and every creak of the timbers feels alive, whispering stories of storms survived, of battles with the sea itself. But lurking beneath this grand adventure are dangers you can't see, tiny, deadly enemies that threaten your very existence. And one of the biggest, the animals aboard that made survival a constant, brutal struggle. Now think about the rats scurrying in the shadows of the ship's dark holds. They weren't just pests, they were carriers of death. Fleas jumping from rat to man, spreading the plague that could wipe out entire crews overnight. These rats weren't tame. They bred fast, their small, sharp teeth biting into wood, cargo, even sailors' flesh when desperation struck. Imagine the terror, the helplessness. A sailor waking to the feeling of a rat's claws on his leg, his skin breaking, blood mixing with sweat and salt. The stench of rot and urine mixed with the bitter smell of fear. Cruel, but real. And it's not just rats. It gets worse. Spiders, venomous and crafty, spinning webs in the dark corners of the ship, waiting for an unsuspecting sailor to pass. Some spiders, like the infamous black widow or tarantulas, had bites that could cause paralysis or death. Imagine a sailor reaching for a rope or trying to fix a sail, only to be bitten by something that injects a venom so potent it might cause hours of agony, muscle paralysis, or even death. And yet sailors pressed on because there was no other choice. Their lives depended on it. But wait, it wasn't just animals for the pests. Think about the snakes. In some voyages, sailors encountered venomous vipers or cobras, especially when ships ventured into tropical waters or stopped in distant ports. These creatures could hide among cargo, in storage areas, or even in the sails. A bite from a venomous snake was often a death sentence. The crew had no anti-venom, no quick medical aid. Just their own instincts, their knowledge, and sometimes bitter herbs or smoke to try to drive them away. The human stories behind this are haunting. Imagine a young sailor, maybe just 20 years old, waking up to find his gums bleeding, his teeth loose from scurvy or malnutrition. His hands tremble from the cold, his skin peeling. Feverish, he fights the relentless onslaught of disease carried by these tiny enemies. Some sailors lost their minds after days of suffering, crying out for help they'd never get. Others simply collapsed, their bodies exhausted, their spirits broken. It was a brutal test of resilience. Every day, sailors faced not only the vast, uncaring ocean, but also these miniature monsters that lurked where they least expected. And the psychological toll, it was enormous. Imagine the constant fear, the paranoia that a rat or spider could bring death at any moment. Imagine the smell of mold, salt and decay in your nostrils, your clothes soaked in sweat, your gums bleeding, your stomach churning from the terrible food, and yet you keep going. Why? Because retreat meant death. Because survival meant fighting on, against odds stacked like a mountain of wood and water. Many sailors developed strange routines, almost superstitions. They would sprinkle herbs like tobacco or spices around the hold, hoping to repel the pests. Some kept cats aboard, a common trick. Cats would hunt rats in the dark, their paws silent as shadows, their eyes glowing in the dim lantern light. This wasn't just about pest control, it was about hope, about keeping the tiny, deadly invaders at bay. But even then, the danger persisted. Sometimes a rat would slip past, or a spider would spin its web in the sailor's face as he slept, catching him unawares. And it wasn't only the pests. Sometimes the environment itself turned against them. The cold was a killer. Imagine icy winds slicing through the ship's hull, freezing sailors' fingers and toes. Frostbite was common. The sea's gift could be a gale that capsized your vessel or a storm that tore apart the mast, leaving you adrift in the endless dark. Sometimes ships would be caught in a violent storm, waves crashing over the deck, the howling wind almost deafening. The sailors' bones would ache from the cold, their teeth chattering uncontrollably. Gengiva sangrando, dentes caindo, bleeding gums, teeth falling out. Their bodies battered and broken, tested to the very limit. And yet they endured. Many sailors saw their ships as prisons, floating on a deadly sea. They fought not only the elements, but also their own despair. Some kept journals, recording every small victory, a rat caught, a spider killed, a storm weathered. These stories weren't just about survival, they were about human grit, about men and women facing the unknown, fighting tiny enemies with simple tools, fire, traps, herbs, and courage. Now let's pause and reflect. Think about how different it is today. We have pest control systems, antivenoms, sanitary routines, and medical care that pirates of the past could only dream of. We can forget the smell of rot, the constant shiver from cold, or the terror of a rat biting into our flesh. We're protected by science, technology, and understanding. But those sailors, they had none of that. Just instinct, ingenuity, and a stubborn refusal to give up. Their story is a testament to human resilience. It's about how ordinary people, thrown into extraordinary conditions, faced tiny monsters that could wipe them out in an instant. Every sailor who endured, who kept fighting despite the filth, the pain, and the fear, left a legacy of courage. Their sacrifices helped shape the age of exploration and colonization. Because, without their relentless spirit, those great voyages wouldn't have happened. So next time you see a rat scurry across your kitchen floor or a spider spin its web in a corner, remember, these tiny creatures once haunted the dreams of sailors, threatening to end their journeys and their lives. And think about the courage it took to face them in the profound, treacherous silence of the open sea. If you want to dive deeper into these stories about how sailors fought back, the tools they used, the innovations born from necessity, I've got more stories coming in the next video. For now, take a breath. Appreciate the modern comforts we often take for granted: clean water, medicine, pest control. Because those brave souls of the colonial age faced a world full of tiny, deadly enemies, and they survived. They endured. Their sacrifices remind us of the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Thanks for sticking with me through this journey. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more tales from the Age of Sail. Because history isn't just about dates and ships, it's about us. The stories of those who dared to face the unknown, no matter how small the enemy. That's the real legacy of the colonial mariners. Their courage, their resilience, and their stubborn will to survive against all odds.